The last person who witnessed it died in 1987, taking the secret with her, but she left behind a single photograph that changes everything we thought we knew. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where fog clings to ridges like secrets, communities handled justice their own way. No waiting around for distant sheriffs or fancy courtrooms here. When someone committed a serious crime, neighbors gathered quickly. They decided guilt or innocence faster than you could split kindling. The mountains themselves created this system. Think about it. Rugged terrain stretched for miles between settlements. A sheriff in the county seat might take days to reach a remote hollow, assuming he even knew something had happened. Roads, more like deer paths that turned to mudslides during spring rains. Winter made travel nearly impossible. By the time official law enforcement arrived, witnesses had scattered, evidence had vanished, and the guilty party could be 3 states away. Early settlers brought English legal traditions with them. Sure enough, but those formal systems worked great back in London, where magistrates lived down the street and constables patrolled familiar neighborhoods. Out here in the wilderness, with bears outnumbering judges by about 1,000 to 1, people adapted fast. Community justice became the only justice that mattered. When mountain folks decided someone needed punishing, they didn't mess around. Exile topped the list of preferred sentences. Get caught stealing from your neighbor's smokehouse. Pack your belongings and never show your face again. This punishment hit harder than it sounds. Being cut off from your community in the 1800s meant losing everything. No family support, no trading partners, no protection from threats. Public shaming came next. The community would gather everyone together and make the wrongdoer confess their crimes in front of wives, children, grandparents, and anyone else within walking distance. For people who valued reputation above almost everything, this social death sentence could destroy a person completely. Some never recovered from the humiliation. Then there were the cases that called for deadlier measures. When someone committed murder, betrayed their neighbors to outsiders, or violated sacred community trust, mountain justice turned violent. These weren't random acts of revenge. They followed unwritten but well-understood rules that everyone accepted. The weird part is how little official documentation exists for any of this. Before the 20th century rolled around, most mountain executions happened without paperwork, witnesses outside the community, or any trace in government records. City newspapers might report hangings that took place on courthouse steps, but deep mountain justice, that stayed hidden in the hollows. Local folks kept their mouths shut for good reasons. They understood that outsiders wouldn't appreciate their methods. Government officials might ask uncomfortable questions. Federal authorities could interfere with systems that worked perfectly fine for generations of mountain people. Well, this silence created something fascinating and terrifying. Stories passed between families about justice delivered in darkness, about methods so secretive that even today, researchers can only guess what really happened. But here's what makes it even more mysterious. Some of these execution techniques were so carefully hidden that they left behind only whispers and legends. What happened when mountain communities decided someone deserved to die, but wanted to make sure nobody would ever find out how? The mountains kept their secrets well. When someone crossed the line in these tight-knit communities, they didn't always make it to the county jail, they just vanished. Local folks called it mountain justice, though nobody would admit to knowing exactly what that meant. What we do know is that people talked in whispers. A thief might be there one morning, gone by sunset, and suddenly everyone in town would find something very interesting to stare at whenever his name came up. Coincidence? Not likely. Deep in the hollows, away from prying eyes, these secret meetings happened under cover of darkness. Think about it. No streetlights, no neighbors for miles, just the sound of wind through the trees. Perfect for handling business nobody wanted recorded in any courthouse ledger. These weren't random acts of violence either. They were organized, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient. The methods? Well, that's where things get particularly grim. Black walnut trees became makeshift gallows. Their sturdy branches could support a man's weight without much trouble. Makes you look at those beautiful trees differently, doesn't it? Then there were the abandoned mine shafts scattered throughout Appalachian territory. Deep dark holes that swallowed secrets whole. A person could disappear down one of those shafts and never surface again. But here's the really chilling part. Some communities got creative about staying quiet. Poison was the weapon of choice when stealth mattered more than making a statement. Mountain folks knew their plants better than any pharmacist. Certain mushrooms, specific roots, even common herbs could become deadly in the right hands. Death would look natural, maybe like a heart attack or sudden illness. And the weird part is how they handled exposure deaths. Leaving someone tied up in the wilderness during winter wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. Come spring, any evidence would look like a hunting accident, or someone who simply got lost in a blizzard. The mountains claimed plenty of lives naturally, so who would question one more? Local sheriffs? They learned quickly not to ask too many questions about certain disappearances. Smart lawmen understood the unspoken rule. Some investigations were better left alone. After all, these same communities that dealt harsh justice to wrongdoers also protected their own fiercely. Cross them, and you might find yourself very much alone when trouble came calling. The silence was deafening, and absolutely complete. Families who witnessed these events took their knowledge to the grave. Children learned early that some stories weren't meant for sharing, especially not with outsiders who wouldn't understand the mountain way of thinking. What's remarkable is how thoroughly these secrets stayed buried. No death certificates, no missing person reports that led anywhere, no evidence trail for future investigators to follow. It was as if certain people had simply been erased from existence entirely. These weren't random vigilantes acting on impulse though. The level of organization behind these disappearances suggests something far more structured was happening in these remote communities. Something that required planning, coordination, and absolute loyalty among participants. The mountains bred their own brand of justice, and sometimes that justice wore a hood. When regular folks felt the law wasn't doing its job, they took matters into their own hands. Enter the Night Riders. These weren't your typical neighborhood watch groups. The Night Riders formed secret societies that operated under cover of darkness, dispensing what they called mountain justice to thieves, adulterers, and anyone who crossed the invisible lines of Appalachian morality. Members took blood oaths, swearing on family Bibles to never reveal their methods to outsiders. Break that oath. Well, you might find yourself on the receiving end of their justice. What made these groups particularly chilling was how organized they were. They held secret meetings in remote caves or abandoned mine shafts, complete with passwords and hand signals. Some groups even had their own crude constitutions, outlining which crimes deserved which punishments. Stealing a neighbor's cattle might earn you a beating. Betraying the community to revenue agents. That could be a death sentence. Then there were the family feuds that masqueraded as vigilante justice. The famous Hatfield-McCoy feud wasn't unique. Dozens of similar blood vendettas played out across Appalachian ridges. These weren't random acts of violence but carefully orchestrated campaigns of revenge that could span generations. Families would hold councils of war to decide the fate of their enemies, complete with mock trials and predetermined verdicts. Local newspapers walked a dangerous tightrope when reporting on these incidents. They'd publish cryptic notices about someone going missing after a hunting accident, or mention that certain individuals had decided to seek opportunities elsewhere. Everyone knew what these euphemisms meant, but nobody dared spell it out. The editors weren't stupid. They lived in these communities too. What's fascinating is how these groups justified their actions using twisted versions of biblical and legal principles. They'd cite Old Testament verses about eye for an eye justice, or invoke ancient Celtic concepts of blood debt that their ancestors brought from the old country. Some groups even appointed judges and juries from their membership, creating elaborate ceremonies that mimicked real court proceedings. The methods they used reflected both practicality and symbolism. Hanging from black walnut trees wasn't just efficient, the wood was considered sacred by some mountain folk. Drowning in mine shafts served dual purposes. It eliminated the body and sent a message about what happened to those who betrayed mining communities to outside authorities. But here's where it gets really dark. These weren't always crimes of passion or spur-of-the-moment decisions. Some executions were planned months in advance, with members assigned specific roles like scouts, executioners, and cleanup crews. They had contingency plans for getting rid of evidence and alibis prepared for every member. The most unsettling part. Many of these vigilante groups operated with the tacit approval of local sheriffs and judges. Some law enforcement officials were members themselves, while others simply looked the other way when certain problems in their communities mysteriously solved themselves. This elaborate network of secret justice created a culture where certain deaths were guaranteed to never appear in official records. And when you combine organized secrecy with mountain isolation, you get the perfect conditions for making executions vanish from history entirely. When someone vanished in the old Appalachian mountains, asking too many questions could get you the same treatment. Fear ran deeper than any holler, and silence became a survival skill. Families knew that talking about what happened to the last guy who crossed the community might make them the next target. The smart ones kept their mouths shut and their heads down. But here's the thing about mountain folk. Most couldn't read or write worth a damn. We're talking about communities where signing your name with an X was perfectly normal. How do you record an execution when half the people involved can't even spell guilty? These weren't educated city dwellers keeping careful records. They were hard-working people who settled disputes with actions, not paperwork. Makes sense, right? Then there's the whole outsider problem. Mountain communities had zero trust for anyone who wasn't born and raised in their specific valley. A traveling judge? Suspicious. A federal marshal? Definitely up to no good. A newspaper reporter from the big city? Might as well be speaking a foreign language. Local codes demanded absolute privacy when it came to community business. What happened in the mountains stayed in the mountains, period. Well, that's assuming anyone could prove something actually happened. The clever communities got creative with their cover-ups. That fellow who supposedly fell off a cliff while hunting. Funny how he was the same guy caught stealing from 3 different families. The man who accidentally drowned in the river during a fishing trip. Strange coincidence that he'd been accused of inappropriate behavior with a neighbor's daughter just weeks before. These weren't sloppy operations, they were carefully orchestrated accidents that left no trail of evidence. Let's not forget the role of local preachers in all this mess. Church leaders held massive influence in mountain communities, and they walked a fine line between moral guidance and practical politics. When a known troublemaker disappeared, ministers often chose to protect their flock's reputation rather than dig for uncomfortable truths. They'd preach about forgiveness on Sunday while quietly blessing the community's decision to handle problems their own way. The weird part is how they justified it, claiming that some sins were too dangerous to leave unpunished by mortal hands, and the families involved. They passed down stories like precious heirlooms, but only to blood relatives who'd proven their loyalty. Grandparents would whisper fragments to trusted grandchildren, never the full story, just enough to understand why certain names were never spoken aloud. These weren't bedtime stories, they were survival guides wrapped in folklore. Even when outside authorities suspected something fishy, they faced a wall of collective amnesia. Everyone suddenly developed hearing problems and memory issues. Witnesses vanished like morning mist. Evidence disappeared faster than free moonshine at a church social. This conspiracy of silence created the perfect storm for lost history. Without written records, reliable witnesses, or physical evidence, entire chapters of Appalachian justice simply evaporated into legend. But those legends didn't just disappear, they transformed into something else entirely, echoing through generations in ways that still shape mountain culture today. Walk through any Appalachian town today, and you'll hear whispers. Old-timers still trade stories about justice that happened in the shadows. These aren't history book tales, they're living memories passed down like family recipes. The difference? These recipes were for revenge. Modern folklorists have become detective historians, chasing ghosts through dusty archives and faded memories. They interview elderly residents who claim their great-grandfathers knew things that happened up the holler. But here's the frustrating part. Every lead turns into smoke. One researcher spent 15 years tracking down a specific story about a moonshiner's execution, only to discover the man had died peacefully in his bed at age 93. Makes you wonder how many other executions were just elaborate community theater. Well, the ballads tell a different story. Mountain music has always been the unofficial record keeper of Appalachian life. Songs like Down in the Willow Garden and Banks of the Ohio don't directly mention secret executions, but they're soaked in themes of deadly justice and bodies hidden in remote places. Coincidence? Probably not. These ballads were the Netflix of their time, entertainment that reflected real community fears and experiences. Then there's the statistical puzzle that nobody talks about. Modern Appalachian communities consistently report some of the lowest crime rates in America. Rural counties that once supposedly handled their own violent justice now see maybe 1 or 2 serious crimes per year. Either these communities figured out the secret to perfect society, or the old reputation still carries weight. Word travels fast in small towns. Maybe potential troublemakers still think twice before testing local patience. But the weird part is how this history shaped modern law enforcement in the region. Sheriff's departments often employ officers whose families have lived there for generations, so they know which families had complicated histories, and which old grudges might still simmer beneath the surface. It's not official policy, obviously, but understanding local dynamics helps prevent problems before they start. Local historians face an impossible task. They're trying to document something that was designed never to be documented. Church records mention mysterious departures from our community, without explanation. Cemetery plots sometimes show dates that don't match death certificates, if death certificates existed at all. Finding concrete proof of these lost execution methods is like trying to photograph a shadow, and the community code persists in subtle ways. Appalachian towns still believe in taking care of your own, whether that means helping neighbors through tough times or handling problems internally. The methods have evolved, sure, but the underlying philosophy remains surprisingly strong. Today's mountain communities channel that same independent spirit into legitimate purposes. They organize volunteer fire departments, community watch programs, and informal mediation systems that keep most conflicts from reaching courtrooms. The violence is gone, but the self-reliance endures. The lost Appalachian execution method remains history's perfect secret, a mystery that may never be solved because it was never meant to be discovered.